Welcome to The Roommate Coach. My name is Mark Lynn. I'll be your host here on KZZH 96.7 FM in Eureka, California. This will be episode 5 of The Roommate Coach, in which I talk about what to do and what not to do when there's trouble, and some of the reasons why, some of the thinking behind that. I should mention here that I am not a professional of any kind, so the ideas and suggestions and information presented here is solely for informational and entertainment purposes. And obviously, if at any time you think you're in any real danger, your best bet is to just get yourself to safety and forget about listening to the radio or anything like that. Safety first. Now, with all that said, I'd like to talk a little bit about just what can you do when things start to really go bad between you and your roommate. I mean, I guess as the old tire commercial said, this is where the rubber meets the road. I mean, it's nice to think that we can set things up in such a way that we don't have any serious conflict, but realistically, we all know that's not the case. There are going to be times when there's going to be major differences of opinion, or someone's going to let someone down or do something that someone just really, really doesn't like. And that's where you can either make things irrevocably awful or maybe establish some patterns and some precedents for dealing with trouble in the future and give things a chance. And once again, another disclaimer. I'm full of disclaimers, I guess. There's no guarantees. Nothing is absolutely 100%. There are some situations that probably won't be salvageable. I'm not promising miracles here. But I do have some pretty reasonable ideas, and I'm going to be quoting a little bit from a book that one of several sources that I have found extremely useful in terms of better ways and more productive ways to deal with each other, and sometimes in times of conflict. In a future episode, I intend to go into some detail about my background and how I got involved in what I'm doing now, how and I became the roommate coach, why I decided to do such a unusual thing. But for now, I'll just mention in passing that part of my background is a fairly conflict heavy. I grew up in a family, like many do, that had more than its share of conflict. Nothing completely over the top. I mean, nobody died, and I don't remember anyone actually getting arrested, but there were times when I wasn't so sure. So anyway, I reached adulthood with a strong desire to understand conflict and figure out what, if anything, could be done to basically to make it a little bit better, a little bit less outrageous. And early on, I discovered the phrase fair fighting. I believe this goes way back, but I believe there was a man named George Bach, and I think one of the books was called The Intimate Enemy. And right offhand, I can't remember the name of the other one. I'll look it up. I think I've got it somewhere. But there was a very simple principle that I remember, in which, in terms of fighting, disagreeing, having arguments and disagreements with people, especially people that you care about, people that are important to you, like family, friends, loved ones, roommates. And the rule was, rather than talk about the other person and what the other person is doing, talk primarily about yourself, about how the situation is affecting you and what exactly is wrong and what you need to change and why. The beauty of that approach is that right away cuts way down on the possibility for defensiveness. I mean, I think we've all seen pretty much, it's almost a cliche, the cycle where people get mad and they start hurling insults at each other, and before you know it, They literally forget the original fight, and now they're just fighting about all the rotten things they've said to each other within the last few minutes. So this approach of just avoiding as much as possible the talking about the other person and talking about yourself. Now that for me was kind of the forerunner to something I've discovered much more recently. I've discovered it just within the last couple of years, although it's been around for a while. I'm referring to a technique, or I guess you'd call it a study, called nonviolent communication. The man who founded it is a man named Marshall Rosenberg, who died recently, just the last year or two. I think he was 80 or so. And the book I will be quoting from a little bit in support of my reasoning about dealing with roommates. This book is called Nonviolent Communication. This is the third edition. It's a fairly recent edition of the book. In some areas, my understanding is the technology, I guess that's what you could call it, the study, it's referred to as compassionate communication. Now that, to me, I like that better. I kind of wish that was the primary title, but that's just nomenclature. As we go along, I'll do the best I can to explain the reasoning behind the title. I am just beginning to get familiar with this particular, again, what's the word for it, with nonviolent communication, NVC they call it. I'm seriously considering getting more involved, and I may even see if there's some way to find some certification or something. I'm not sure about that yet. But the interesting thing to me is much of what I've read and heard about it so far is the kind of thing that I have tended to do for many years in my own life anyway. And part of that is probably because I've studied this kind of thing. You know, the saying, there's nothing entirely new under the sun, that we all build on each other's discoveries and everything. So that's what I will be referring to in terms of some better ways to communicate, especially when you're upset and when things are tense and when you do care about maintaining and not damaging the relationship. You're listening to The Roommate Coach. This is episode 5, talking about roommate troubles and some things to do about them. My name is Mark Lynn, and this is KZZH 96.7 FM in Eureka, California. If you'd like to leave any questions or comments or feedback, you can reach me at theroommatecoach.com. There is a contact link on the front page, and you can also leave a voicemail for me 24/7 at local number 707-362-8000. That's 707-362-8000. The main premise behind the Roommate Coach is the concept, the notion that we can get along, that even though we tend to have different values and goals, and especially when we're living together as roommates, we're inevitably going to bother each other, annoy each other from time to time. But my whole point is that it's possible and very much desirable to figure out how to deal with that simple reality without damaging or destroying the relationship. And of course, one of many reasons for this goal is the fact that as roommates, we need each other. We're roommates for a reason, frequently primarily financial, but other reasons as well, as I've discussed in other shows and will discuss more in the future. So where do we go from there? This is why I really like nonviolent communication, and I have a quote here from the book Nonviolent Communication by Marshall Rosenberg that in just a couple sentences captures very nicely an awful lot of what I believe he was about in dedicating his life to nonviolent communication, and it also says an awful lot about what I'm trying to accomplish here with the roommate coach. So let me get to that quote. Okay, this is from page 54 of the third edition of Nonviolent Communication by Marshall Rosenberg. Anyway, I quote, "It has been my experience over and over again that from the moment people begin talking about what they need rather than what's wrong with one another, the possibility of finding ways to meet everybody's needs is greatly increased." End quote. Now, I believe there are so many things to like about this point of view that in one way of looking at it, it's kind of amazing that we have as much trouble getting along with each other as we do, since what he says here is, in fact, one way we could deal with each other. So why is there so much trouble? Now, that's a big question right there, which I'll be discussing at length in future shows. But briefly, and he mentions this, I may find a couple more quotes too from the book, that our society pretty much encourages us to find fault with each other, to criticize each other, and basically to more or less consistently be at odds with each other. We aren't really encouraged as a society to do everything we can to live together harmoniously. It's really easier for those that would like to pretty much run things and maintain tension and insecurity and basically protecting us from all of our enemies. It's easier to do that if we're, like I say, at odds with each other. And in order to be at odds with each other, we need to find fault with each other. We need to learn that when something goes wrong, we instantly should start criticizing each other. And that's the beauty of the nonviolent communication approach, is he says, no, that's the exact opposite of what to do. Now, one thing that he didn't mention in this particular quote, I believe he mentions it elsewhere, one of many reasons why talking about yourself and your own needs rather than the other person is such a good idea, is that, let's face it, that's the only person in the whole universe that you're really fully qualified to talk about. None of us has any way of really knowing what another person's motivations are, what's in their heart, as they say. Yeah, we can see what they do, and we can talk about what they do, and we can talk about how we react to it. But much of the time, people go farther than that, and they start talking about motivations and just part of the whole attack. And another way to put what Rosenberg is saying and what I'm saying is that when you're in a hole, stop digging. If things are starting to go wrong between you and your roommate, the last thing you want to do is make them go worse. And the way to avoid doing that is by simply concentrating on your own needs, as Rosenberg says, and avoid talking about what's wrong with the other person. Now, there's another, maybe even more immediate reason why many of us tend to pretty much go on the attack to some extent when someone does something we don't like. And that's simply because in many cases that's what we have experienced. That's what has happened to us in a variety of settings when we did something that somebody disapproved of. Now, the somebody in question might have been a family member, might have been a teacher, could have been another person, a friend, a relative. It doesn't really matter. But we have a tendency, it's kind of a distortion of the old golden rule, we have a tendency to do unto others what has been done to us. And unfortunately, even in those cases where we really didn't like what was done to us, we have a tendency to go ahead and do it anyway. And this can be a problem, as the last several thousand years of our history as a species would indicate. Now, this is a good time to point out one of many consequences of my approach and the NVC approach to conflict is I don't advocate blaming or guilt or shame or any of that stuff. And the reason I'm saying that right at this juncture is that frequently when I talk about things that happened to us, maybe when we were younger, maybe in our families, lots of times people get upset, and a lot of times people just don't want to any real reference to their family. They don't want anyone picking on their family. And that's the neat thing about this approach to dealing with things. We're not picking on anyone, whether it's your roommate or a family member or a friend or anybody. If someone does something that's wrong, something that bothers you, that you consider wrong, I mean to say, you don't need to attack the person. You don't need to call the person names. You just need to figure out how to deal with your own reaction to it and figure out how to get the situation changed so that you get more of what you need and less of what you don't. So no one's calling anyone any names. Now, that's not to say that it's not reasonable to point out if someone does something that you find harmful, no matter who the person is. I don't see anything wrong with telling the truth. But that's the great thing about not getting heavily involved in blaming and shaming and all that stuff. Okay, this is only episode 5 of The Roommate Coach, so I'm still kind of figuring out the best way to do things. I'm going to set a precedent here and have a second station break in one show. Make it a brief one. This is The Roommate Coach. I'm Mark Lynn, and this is KZZH 96.7 FM in Eureka, California. Okay, I just remembered another book, another author I read a while back that included, that, as I recall, incorporated some of the NVC, the nonviolent communication principles. The book I'm thinking of, the author is Haim Ginott, Ginott. I think he was Swedish, and I never was sure exactly how to pronounce his name. But he had some pretty well-known books, though I think his best known was Between Parent and Child. He was a very well-received and I think an excellent child psychologist. And what he talked about, and again, it sounds a lot like what Rosenberg has to say, he was specifically talking about how parents could, and he argued should, communicate with their children. And he basically, he said things like, rather than yell at the child and blame the child specifically for something that goes wrong, some mistake the child makes, just focus on the event itself and whatever happened and focus on solutions. He gave the classic example of the little kid spills the milk and one parent just gets all upset and screams at the kid and makes him feel terrible for being so clumsy and all that stuff. And the other parent says, "Oh, well, I see the milk has spilled. Well, here, I'll help you clean it up." Now, this is interesting. And again, I'm not going to go into any great detail on NVC at this point. I'll reserve that for future shows, partially because I'm still getting more familiar with it myself. But I'm pretty sure that little example with the spilled milk demonstrates several of the primary techniques in nonviolent communication. The steps that Rosenberg talks about are, let's see, how does it go? Observation, feeling, need, and request. He basically says, again, this is all in lieu of name calling and blaming and basically yelling at the other person for doing something that you didn't like. He talks about noticing and basically describing what it is, the observation part, then talking about your feelings, how that made you feel, if you're upset or scared or frustrated or whatever, and what you need instead. In the case of the mother, she needed the milk to be cleaned up, and a request. And the parent in that example requested that the child help clean up the milk. Really pretty straightforward. Now, one thing I like to add, a principle that I think is really important in maintaining a good relationship, even when, and I'm tempted to say especially when things go wrong, when there's potential trouble, is to maintain the contact, maintain the emotional communication. The nice thing about the two examples of the spilled milk, with the first example, the mother is clearly not connected emotionally at that point to the child. The child feels alone, and if anything, the mother has temporarily become the enemy, and that's a pretty lonely feeling. Whereas in the second example, they're still on the same side. They're figuring out together how to solve this problem of the spilled milk. Now, if you translate that into a roommate situation, my thing is, which situation is more likely to end with people getting what they want? One where they become enemies, or where they remain allies? And to me, I think the answer is pretty straightforward, which is why I'm the roommate coach. There's a central point in the various things I've mentioned in this episode regarding dealing with roommate problems in nonviolent communication and in the fair fighting techniques described by George Bach in some of his books, and also in Haim Ginott, the child psychologist books. And the thing that I like to emphasize is the importance of maintaining some kind of connection between people that are important to you when you're discussing trying to resolve a problem. It's very difficult to resolve a problem while you're attacking someone, and the other side of that is it's very hard to remain in a cooperative mood while you're being attacked. And to me, I think that's a big part of the power of these techniques, is by focusing on solutions, by focusing on the problem rather than the personalities involved. And once again, for the millionth time, I'll repeat that it's not a guarantee. There are still going to be challenges. But by removing the big challenge of the endless defensiveness and the discussion itself becoming the new problem, there's just so much more likelihood of being able to make some improvement with the original problem. So that is about it for this particular episode, although I will take a minute and mention some future plans. I'm hoping to begin having interviews in the fairly near future, both local interviews here in Humboldt County and also either telephone or Skype interviews. One thing I've mentioned as far as local interviews, if anyone's listening and maybe would like to suggest either being interviewed or suggest someone that might be a good interviewee, a real interesting connection here in this area, like many areas, that I think intersects with the roommate issue is the housing issue. And housing is a big deal and a big problem pretty much everywhere, definitely here in Humboldt County, for students, for seniors, for people struggling to make ends meet. So the relevance there is if it's possible to have a successful roommate situation, you can obviously cut down on your housing expense per individual. That's kind of the whole point. So I'm hoping to find some people that, and again, that's not the only issue, but that's one thought that comes to mind. So if someone would like to suggest someone, I guess it's a good time to go ahead and wrap things up and tie that in. If you do have just any general comments or questions, or if you want to suggest someone for an interview, possibly yourself, you could do that at theroommatecoach.com, and on the homepage there's a contact link. My name is Mark Lynn, and this has been episode 5 of The Roommate Coach, in which we talked about dealing with roommate problems. I think we'll probably have to call that part 1. I'm sure there will be more, a lot more to talk about. And this is station KZZH 96.7 FM in Eureka, California. And once again, I'd like to thank the people at Access Humboldt, that's accesshumboldt.net, for not only getting KZZH on the air here in Eureka, but also allowing me to be on the air and talk about my adventures as the roommate coach. And one more thing, the bumper music that I use for my beginnings and endings and station breaks and bumpers, I guess, is called Rollin' at 5, and that's by Kevin MacLeod. Thanks a lot for listening, and I'll talk to you again real soon.